65%. According to the Mental Health Commission of Canada, that's the percentage of men who experience a diagnosable mental illness at some point in their lives. When I first came across that number, I couldn't believe how high it was. I'd battled depression in the past myself, but it always felt like I was alone in that battle. I would have never imagined that more than half the men around me would go through a similar experience. The truth is, despite its prevalence, very few men talk about how they're feeling. In fact, a recent Priority survey estimates that 40% of men have never once spoken about their mental health to anyone. When asked why, most said that they were too embarrassed, didn't want to appear weak, or simply just learned to deal with it. And I totally get how they felt. Throughout my own experience with depression, I always had this internal dialogue telling me to be a man about it. This idea that I should be able to handle mere emotions on my own. Even just the idea of having depression felt like a weakness, and I didn't want to make things worse by expressing that. Now, recently we have seen a lot of advocacy for speaking up about mental health, but the world of masculinity has largely rejected this stance. Most of men's mental battles are still silent due to the way we associate concealing our emotions with being a man. Today, I'm here to break down why that is, what it means for men, and ask one simple question. Does it have to be that way? The Oxford Dictionary defines masculinity as the qualities and attributes regarded as characteristics of men or boys. Especially in the Western world, these qualities include traits like strength, courage, independence, and leadership. Canadian society celebrates these masculine qualities, and they definitely should. They're all great attributes for anyone to strive for. They help men achieve their goals and feel confident in who they are. But it becomes more interesting when we look at exactly how society has linked these masculine traits with the concealing of emotions. For example, when we think of a strong and courageous man, we often see this stone-faced persona, unaffected by any emotions that may come his way. When we think of independence, we think of a man who can deal with all his emotions internally and on his own. And to be a great leader, it is thought that men must never show vulnerability or stop and ask for help. And this kind of perspective is reflected everywhere we look. It starts when we're young, hearing messages like, boys don't cry, man up, or stop being a girl when we do something that shows emotions as kids. Now, I was lucky enough that my family didn't say these things, but I definitely heard them all the time while playing sports, on social media, or just from the other men around me. As we grow up, emotions are rarely ever talked about, especially in all-male settings. Even in TV shows and movies, the uber-manly characters are often the ones who show little to no emotion. The common theme being pushed here is that the less you show your emotions, the more of a man you become. Now, some of you may be thinking that this is kind of an outdated, a dying perspective. We have seen the rise of global men's mental health movements like Movember, and it feels like we might actually be moving away from this association between concealing our emotions and being a man. But what if I told you that the exact opposite was also happening? In fact, as a reaction to this growing movement, a new crop of male figures have exploded in popularity very recently, claiming that men are losing touch with their manhood by expressing their emotions. You may have heard of one of these men in particular, the third most Googled person of 2023, Andrew Tate. Now, Tate is often criticized for his views surrounding women, but today I want to take a closer look at his views surrounding men. Along with many others, Tate preaches that there is a rigid way in which men should act. One of his main points being that men who show their emotions are weak. And in today's social media, we'll see tons of posts and videos centered around this idea that are directed towards young men. Here's one of Tate's on X, formerly known as Twitter. According to Tate, the masculine way of handling emotions is to simply ignore them, to continue with the exact same tasks at the exact same vigor, regardless of what you're feeling. He just wants to win. And for him, there's no place for emotions in the pursuit of wealth, status, or popularity. He even calls upon that masculine trait of strength, claiming that this is a way to show that your mind is stronger than your emotions. And this type of perspective has become increasingly popular amongst young men. But why? Well, a lot of the traditional mental health advocacy hasn't really resonated with men because talking about emotions hasn't really fit with our concept of masculinity. Tate's view, on the other hand, does fit with our pre-existing stereotypes and provides a simple, comfortable, and socially acceptable way for men to deal with their emotions instead. And this advice is especially enticing to those of us who will struggle with a mental health issue. Think about it. When you're experiencing difficult emotions, wouldn't it be amazing, life-changing even, if you could just ignore them without any consequences? Tate makes us believe in that very possibility. According to him, all you have to do is just keep pushing those emotions down and move forward as if they don't exist. Along with many others, I subscribed to this idea throughout my depression. I wanted to be a man about it, and Tate's option felt like the only right way for me to do that. I pushed down my emotions time and time again, and in the beginning I was pretty successful in continuing on as if my emotions didn't exist, as if my depression didn't exist. But as time progressed, a few things started to happen. First off, my depressive thoughts and feelings got significantly worse, and as they continued to grow, they became increasingly difficult to hide. I was determined not to show it, so I began to isolate myself from friends and family so that they wouldn't see me struggle. I wanted to prove to myself that I was man enough to deal with this all on my own without any help. Eventually, I pushed down my emotions so much that I stopped feeling any emotion at all. I'd become this lifeless shell of a man that was just kind of going through the motions day by day. According to traditional masculinity, or a more traditional masculinity, I was doing everything right. I was being strong and courageous by continuing to ignore my emotions and move forward, no matter how bad they got. I was being more independent than ever because I had isolated myself from my friends and family, choosing to deal with this on my own. And because I was entirely emotionless, I had become exactly like Tate. Happy or sad, I was doing the exact same tasks at the exact same vigor. But in the process, I had lost connection to almost everyone and everything that I cared about. I had this terrible sense of emptiness, except for a deep pain just growing bigger inside me. And sure, I was working hard, but I'd completely lost my purpose, my passion for even doing so in the first place. I was sacrificing so much just to put on this persona of a man who could handle it on his own. Eventually, things got so bad that I even considered taking my own life. The life I was living had no more substance to it anymore, and I felt like the only way I could continue to hide these emotions was to permanently take them out of existence. I thought that this masculine way of dealing with emotions was supposed to make me into a better man, but it did the opposite and almost killed me in the process. So what went wrong? Let's take a moment to look towards the science of emotions to find some of these answers. The psychological term we use when we consciously stop ourselves from expressing emotion is called emotional suppression. Research from Cambridge University shows that when we suppress these emotions, it only really stops them from being outwardly expressed. That means it doesn't actually do anything to make the emotions feel less intense or go away internally. And when we feel intense emotions, things like deep sadness, anger, shame, or anxiety, the amygdala is put into high gear and triggers a stress response. Our brains can handle this stress without damage for a short period of time. But if you continue to suppress your emotions, it prolongs that stress response, and eventually the brain stops working properly. The production of your neurotransmitters starts to change, and your receptors become either too sensitive or not sensitive enough. And it's these very system faults that are believed to increase negative thoughts, decrease mood, lower motivation, and reduce the ability to cope with stress, which provide the perfect breeding grounds for either a new mental health issue or the worsening of pre-existing ones. Not only that, but the high emotional stress is also linked to a bunch of physical issues, things like heart disease, intestinal problems, headaches, insomnia, and various autoimmune disorders. To cope with all these new problems, the risk of substance abuse, aggression, suicide rate have all been shown to increase. And to top it all off, emotional suppression stops us from reaching out to others, leading to reduced closeness and lower social satisfaction. As you can see, concealing your emotions, emotional suppression, is really harmful for a number of reasons. And when we look at the recent data, we can find that a lot of the problems that seem to come from emotional suppression are the same ones that disproportionately concern men. For example, men are almost twice as likely to abuse illicit drugs and alcohol when compared to women. Men are more than 3 times as likely to commit violent crimes when compared to women. Men have reported to be lonelier than women across all age groups, with a recent Angus Reid survey finding that 63% of 18 to 34-year-old men experience considerable loneliness and isolation. And scariest of all, males account for more than 75% of all suicides in Canada. This means that out of the 12 people on average committing suicide in Canada each day, 9 of them will be men. So is this really what we want for our young men? Is this truly what it means to be masculine? As you can see, this idea of emotional suppression preached by Tate and many others is nothing but a short-term fix. In the long run, it is absolutely ruining boys, both physically and mentally. Constantly suppressing your emotions and continuing on with the exact same tasks with the exact same vigor isn't beneficial, nor is it realistic. It is purely destructive for men. So what does work? Well, pretty much the opposite. Recent neuroimaging studies have found that putting your emotions into words, a process called affect labeling, can make a really big difference. According to Matthew Lieberman, a professor of psychology at UCLA, putting your emotions into words is what can actually reduce that stress response from your amygdala. Not only that, but Lieberman's work also suggests that expressing your emotions, that affect labeling, putting your emotions into words, has an effect on the prefrontal cortex of your brain, which is associated in processing and understanding these emotions. Essentially, this means that talking about your emotions can help you actually feel less of whatever emotion is bothering you, help you feel less sad, less anxious, less angry. Instead of the cascading downfall that comes from suppressing emotions, talking about your emotions to someone you can trust can make a real and positive difference. It also opens the door up to next steps, to finding the additional support that you may need depending on what you're going through. And I know this was the case for me. When I was close to taking my own life, I went against my masculine intuition and opened up about how I was feeling. I confided in my family and ended up getting the help that I desperately needed. It was a long and difficult path to recovery, but one that actually allowed me to get well again. So now I hope you can see that emotional suppression isn't the path to success for men. But hold on a second. We haven't exactly addressed the societal problem here. No matter how good it is for men, talking about emotions still feels emasculating. It's as if men have to choose between protecting their mental health and being a man. So how do we bridge this gap? Well, as a social construct, masculinity is a fluid concept. It's up to each and every one of us to define what being masculine looks like. So what if we try to change in perspective? What if we could reconceptualize masculinity, just slightly, into something that incorporates emotional expression without compromising any of its core values? I believe we can do just that. I'll use the 4 masculine qualities from earlier. Here you can see that they're attached to emotional suppression, but with its negative effects in mind, we can question if these connections are even viable at all. So let's start with strength. We know now that continuing to pretend we are fine despite any persisting emotions actually makes men weaker long-term, both physically and mentally. For courage, emotional suppression literally means to hide your emotions, to pretend that they don't exist when they clearly do. I don't know about you, but choosing to pretend something doesn't exist just because it's difficult or uncomfortable to deal with feels pretty cowardly to me, especially when we know that addressing emotions leads to long-term benefits. So what if instead we could link strength and courage with talking about our emotions? If doing something strong is to endure some kind of difficulty in order to see improvement, emotional expression fits that way better than emotional suppression does. Obviously, talking about emotions is hard, not to mention the fact that men have to go against a societal norm on top of that. But talking about emotions despite this difficulty is the evidence-backed way to see that improvement, to lessen that effect of your emotions. Similarly, we can demonstrate courage by facing these emotions head-on and taking the steps to address and overcome them, instead of just pretending they don't exist. Now, obviously that can be difficult or uncomfortable, but that's what courage is all about, facing some kind of short-term vulnerability in exchange for some long-term improvement. So as you can see, strength and courage is involved in emotional expression, just like it is in emotional suppression. The only difference here is that emotional expression, talking about your emotions, actually yields those positive results. So now let's look at independence. When we deal with emotions completely on our own, we may be alone, but are we truly thinking independently? Most men have essentially been socialized into this idea of emotional suppression. It's what we've been told, conditioned, or influenced into doing. But true independent thinking is being able to do what's best for you, not just what some societal stereotype tells you to do, or what some self-proclaimed masculinity guru tells you to do on the internet. If you are suppressing your emotions and feeling any of these consequences, you can show your independence by deviating from this norm, talking about your emotions and taking those necessary steps to getting better. And finally, to lead is to guide others towards success. both individually and as a collective. Now that we know that suppressing your emotions isn't the path to success for men, we can demonstrate leadership ourselves by encouraging other men to talk about their emotions. Now, these conversations are really rare. This might be the first time in your friend group, in your family, or in your community that this type of conversation is being opened up. And that can be difficult, uncomfortable, and scary. But last time I checked, that has never stopped good men and good leaders from doing something good for the world. And I know it can be done. I took my first step today and shared my experience with all of you. Now, I'm calling on each and every one of you to take a step of your own. If this talk resonates with you, please encourage boys and men to speak up about their emotions. And that goes for everyone, man, woman, or otherwise. It's up to each and every one of us to define what being masculine looks like. So please encourage boys and men to speak up about their emotions. Ask them if they're okay, and tell them that if they're expressing their emotions, that doesn't make them any less of a man. It only makes them stronger. Create those safe environments for men to be open and honest about how they're feeling. And finally, to all the men listening today battling mental illness, either now or in the future, remember that you are not alone. 65% of us share this battle, and I shared this battle with you. I hope you will see the strength, the courage, the independence, and the leadership that comes with opening up about your struggles and seeking the appropriate help. I hope you will take those necessary steps to truly overcome your emotions and move on to bigger things. Simply put, I hope you'll be a man about it. Thank you.